The crystal felt heavy in my hand as I watched Michael raise his glass. Around us, 30 guests smiled in the candlelight of our dining room, completely oblivious to what was about to happen. My son was making a beautiful toast to my resilience, to my late husband, to the 4 decades of marriage we were supposed to be celebrating tonight. Across the table, his wife Danielle wore an eager, expectant smile. She was watching me, waiting for me to take a sip. Instead, I watched Michael. I knew exactly what was floating in the vintage champagne he was holding to his lips, because less than a minute ago I was the one who had quietly swapped our glasses. A mother's instinct is supposed to scream when her child is in danger. Mine was silent. I did not blink. I did not stop him. He closed his eyes and drank. Before I tell you how I reached that moment, let me say this gently. If someone you loved ever made you doubt your own mind, this story may sit heavily with you. I know what it is to be looked at with pity when you are telling the truth, and I know how lonely that can feel inside your own family. If that has happened to you, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Your city, your country, wherever you call home. I'd like to know who's sitting with me tonight, because no one should carry this silence alone. 2 years earlier, I had buried my husband Richard after 43 years of marriage, and I had learned that grief was not loud the way people imagine. It was quiet. It settled into the chair across from mine, into the half of the closet I couldn't open without stopping to breathe, into the habits that suddenly had nowhere to land. Richard and I had kept one tradition without fail. Every anniversary, no matter where we were or what storms had passed through our lives, he opened the same champagne he had served at our wedding. He would lift his glass, look at me as if we were still 25, and say, "To the years behind us and the ones we'll steal." It used to make me laugh. After he died, it made my throat tighten in a way I could not explain to anyone who had not built a life brick by brick. That year would have been our 45th anniversary, so I decided to host a memorial dinner in his honor, not a gloomy affair. Richard would have hated that. Candlelight, polished silver, family recipes, the crystal flutes, and the champagne he loved. A proper evening, the kind of evening that lets memory sit beside you without turning it into a spectacle. My son Michael and his wife Danielle had been, as everyone said, so attentive since the funeral. They moved closer. They started visiting weekly. Danielle brought soup I had not asked for, and flowers arranged perfectly enough to feel planned. Michael insisted on handling things for me, the taxes, calls, repairs around the house. "You shouldn't carry the details alone, Mom," he kept saying, with that voice people use when they want credit for kindness. I listened. But Richard used to say I noticed what other people stepped over. He meant it affectionately, though it was true. I had spent 35 years as a pharmaceutical researcher, catching contaminants, reading patterns in numbers, finding the one thing that did not belong in an otherwise clean result. And before long, something in my own home did not belong either. It began, as these things often do, in ways that were easy to excuse if you wanted to be kind. About 6 months before that anniversary dinner, I started having what Michael called little episodes. After supper at his house, I would feel a heaviness behind my eyes, as if someone had slipped lead weights beneath my lids. My speech would soften around the edges. Once I lost 10 minutes in the middle of a conversation and came back to find Danielle touching my wrist with theatrical concern. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, that isn't normal." No, it wasn't. The pattern took shape slowly, but once I saw it, I could not unsee it. The fog never descended after lunch with friends, never after church coffee, never after the evenings I spent home alone reading. It came after dinners in Michael's dining room, after Danielle floated in with a glass and set it down in front of me as if she were doing something tender. She was the one who suggested a neurologist first. Michael brought it up more carefully, as though he hated himself for saying it. Maybe it was time, he said, to simplify a few responsibilities, let him help with the bills, let Danielle coordinate appointments. "Just until we know what's going on, Mom." I nodded. I even thanked him. Then I went home and wrote everything down. 35 years in pharmaceutical research had taught me that symptoms matter less than timing. Timing tells the truth. So I started paying attention the way I always had in a lab, to sequence, dosage, conditions, repetition. At one dinner, while Danielle was carrying in potatoes and Michael was opening another bottle, I poured my wine into the ficus beside the buffet. I spent the rest of the evening lucid. No slurring, no dizziness, no missing pieces. The next week, I did something uglier because by then I needed certainty more than innocence. When Danielle leaned across me to answer the door, I switched our glasses. It was a small movement, steady, invisible. 20 minutes later, she pressed 2 fingers to her temple and said she had a migraine. Michael rushed to help her upstairs. He looked frightened, not for her pain, for the interruption. That was the moment the possibility hardened into fact. But fact was not enough. If I accused them then, I already knew what I would hear. 3 weeks before the anniversary, Michael stopped by to drop off groceries I had not requested. He moved through my kitchen with the ease of someone who had already begun thinking of it as his. While he was carrying bags from the car, his laptop sat open on my counter, the screen still bright. I did not intend to look, but the tab was visible, and once I read the first line, I could not stop. It was a draft email to an elder law attorney. The subject line read, "Expediting POA, time sensitive." In the body, my son had written that his mother was experiencing rapid cognitive decline, that her physician had documented signs of early-stage dementia, and that the family needed to move quickly to protect her assets before she made decisions she could not understand. I stood very still. Then I took up my phone and photographed the screen. Later that week, I requested my own medical records. It took 2 phone calls and a fax, because apparently I was too confused to use a patient portal. When the documents arrived, I saw what had been done. The neurologist Danielle had recommended, the one who had listened so patiently to my symptoms, had written notes I had never seen. Mild disorientation, short-term memory impairment, recommend continued monitoring and family support in financial matters. Every episode I had described to him had been induced. He did not know that, but Michael did. The last piece came almost by accident. Michael left his coat draped over a chair one evening, and when I moved it, a receipt slipped from the pocket. A veterinary supply company. A sedative purchased in quantity. Michael and Danielle do not own a pet. I folded the receipt and placed it back exactly as it had fallen. That night, I sat in Richard's study with the champagne glass from our first anniversary turning slowly in my hands. This was not impulse. This was architecture. My son was building a paper trail designed to erase me, and he had been building it for months. I did not scream. I did not call Michael. I did not do any of the things a person is supposed to do when they discover that their own child has been poisoning them slowly enough to make it look like nature. Instead, I sat in Richard's study with the lights off and the champagne glass from our first anniversary resting in my lap. 45 years I had kept that glass. It had survived 3 moves, 2 earthquakes, and the kind of ordinary carelessness that breaks most fragile things. I turned it slowly in my hands and thought about what Richard would have said. He would have told me to be certain, he would have told me to be calm, and he would have told me not to give Michael the chance to rearrange the story before I finished understanding it. So I called Frank, Richard's brother, a retired attorney, the only person left in this family whose loyalty I did not have to question. I laid out the evidence piece by piece, the symptoms, the tests, the email, the sedative, the medical records that had been written to bury me. Frank listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You need witnesses," he finally said, "and you need him to prove it himself." I told him about the anniversary dinner, 30 guests, family from across the country, candlelight and crystal, and the kind of occasion no one refuses. "Then that's the room," Frank said. I agreed. I would play the role Michael had written for me, declining, confused, grateful for his care. I would let Danielle pour my glass and smile as if I trusted her. And when no one was watching, I would swap them. My son wanted me to disappear quietly. I intended to let him show the room exactly who he was. The weeks that followed required a kind of acting I had never done before. Not theatrical performance, but something quieter and more painful, becoming the woman my son had already decided I was. I forgot names. I repeated stories I had just told. I asked Michael the same question about the gardener 3 times in one visit and watched his face shift from impatience to something almost like satisfaction. At dinner, I agreed, tearfully, that perhaps he should help with my finances. "Just until I'm feeling sharper," I said, letting my voice thin out the way elderly women do in films when they're meant to seem pitiful. Danielle's smile grew wider each time I stumbled. Michael began mentioning the house. 4 bedrooms was too many for a woman alone, he said. The stairs were a liability. Perhaps it was time to think about something more manageable. Somewhere closer to them where they could keep an eye on me. I nodded. I thanked him for caring. And every evening I sat at the kitchen table and wrote down exactly what they had said, what they had touched, what they had looked at too long. I noticed Danielle photographing the silver twice. I saw Michael measuring the window frames in the living room as if he were already calculating resale value. They were not waiting for me to die. They were cataloging what they planned to take while I was still breathing. I sent invitations to the entire extended family, cousins, nieces, old friends of Richard's, people who had not gathered under this roof in years. I told Michael it might be my last chance to host properly. He placed his hand over mine and told me not to talk like that, but behind him Danielle caught his eye. The look that passed between them was unmistakable. They were almost there. They believed the woman sitting in front of them was fading. They did not know that I had never been sharper in my life. The dining room glowed the way it always had on anniversaries, candles in silver holders, white tablecloths pressed smooth, 30 guests settling into chairs with the particular warmth that comes from being gathered in a home that holds memory. I stood at the head of the table where Richard used to stand and let myself look at each face. Cousins who had driven hours, old friends who still remembered our wedding, nieces balancing plates and wine glasses and small children on their laps. Michael rose to give the toast. He held his glass high and spoke beautifully about my resilience, my grace, my devotion to his late father. He called me remarkable. He said he hoped to carry even half my strength into his own marriage. Across the room, I saw Danielle watching me with her usual soft smile. She had placed my champagne directly in front of me before taking her seat, positioning the glass as if it were a kindness. I waited. When Danielle turned to greet a cousin she hadn't seen in months, I moved. My hand was steady. The switch took less than 2 seconds. No one saw, no one except Frank, who was watching from across the room with his hands folded and his expression perfectly still. Michael raised his glass. I raised mine. "To the years behind us," I said, finishing Richard's line, "and the ones we'll steal." Michael drank deeply. The champagne disappeared in 3 swallows. Within 4 minutes his words began to soften at the edges. Within 7 he reached for the table to steady himself. His face had gone pale. Danielle was beside him instantly, her voice high and panicked, asking if someone should call a doctor. I set my glass down and spoke clearly enough for the entire room to hear. "It's the sedative, dear. The one you've been putting in my drinks for 6 months." The silence that followed was absolute. I reached into my jacket and produced the photographs, the receipts, the medical records that had been falsified without my knowledge. I read Michael's email aloud, every word, including the phrase, "rapid cognitive decline." Danielle tried once. "She's confused. This is one of her episodes." But Frank was already stepping forward. He held a notarized statement from a toxicologist who had tested my blood after a dinner 2 months prior. The compound matched the veterinary sedative. The dosage was consistent. There was no escape. The family stared. Some covered their mouths. Others looked at Michael as though they had never seen him before. He stared up at me from where he had slumped against his chair, and in his eyes I saw something I did not recognize. He had never expected me to look back, but I had never looked away. The police came before dessert was cleared. One of my cousins had already called them from the hallway, his voice shaking so badly he could barely give the address. Michael was taken first to the hospital, because even betrayal does not exempt a body from consequence, and from there he was arrested. Danielle lasted less than 48 hours before she began trying to save herself. She told investigators she did not know what was in the champagne, that Michael had handled everything, that she had only been trying to help a struggling family. But the purchase receipts were in her name, and so were 2 pharmacy-adjacent orders made from her email account. Concern leaves a paper trail when it is real. So does greed. Frank put me in touch with an attorney the very next morning. We filed for a protective order, then we filed a civil suit. The neurologist who had documented my so-called decline was reported to the medical board and placed under licensing review. He may have been careless rather than cruel, but carelessness in a white coat can still ruin a life. Michael eventually pleaded to felony elder abuse. Danielle took a deal. I am told both of them cried in court. I would not know. I did not attend every hearing, and I did not visit my son in detention. The calls from extended family came for weeks afterward. People I had not spoken to in years said they were appalled, ashamed, heartsick that they had missed it. I told them the truth. There was nothing for them to forgive. The people who should have seen it were the ones designing the blindfold. As for Michael, I had nothing left to say. Silence was the only inheritance I still had any right to keep intact. I sold the house in the spring. It was the right size for a family, and I was no longer interested in maintaining the architecture of a life built for people who had chosen to leave it. I moved to a smaller place near the coast where the light comes in sideways in the mornings and the water is never completely quiet. Richard had always said that was where we would end up eventually. He was right, as he usually was. He simply did not make it here with me. I kept one thing from the old house that mattered, the champagne glass from our first anniversary, the one I held in my lap the night I decided not to disappear. On what would have been our 46th anniversary, I opened the same vintage Richard always chose. I poured one glass. There was no one watching, no modified drink, no theater of any kind, just the sound of the water outside and the light moving across the rim. If you have stayed with me this long, then I want to say something directly to you. They counted on my love making me blind, but love doesn't make you stupid. It makes you patient. If someone needs you confused to stay close to you, they were never close to begin with. And this, above everything, trust your mind. It remembers who sharpened the knife. If there was ever a moment you trusted yourself when no one else would, I would like to hear it. Leave it in the comments. And if this story sat with you, please subscribe. I'll be here.